org. And from the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
Investors start to bet that the banking crisis of the last few days may have been contained.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Palo Alto Networks. Palo Alto Networks delivers what's next in cybersecurity innovation to protect today's digital way of life. Learn more at paloaltonetworks.com.
I'm David Brancaccio. No new banks have gone bust since the initial two, Silicon Valley and Signature, where in those two cases, all depositors have access to their money, even what had been uninsured deposits. President Biden says taxpayers will bear no losses for this rescue. So where's the money coming from? It's called the Deposit Insurance Fund. Marketplace's Stephanie Hughes took a look.
Any bank insured by the FDIC has to pay quarterly premiums to the FDIC.
I guess it is life insurance. It's basically life insurance for a bank.
Dan Giedemann is an economics professor at Grand Valley State University. And just like with life insurance, if the bank is healthy,
but we'll charge them a much lower premium than if somebody maybe behaves recklessly.
Those premiums are the main source of revenue for the FDIC's Deposit Insurance Fund. At the end of 2022, it had over $128 billion in it. It's unclear at the moment how much paying the depositors of the failed banks will set the fund back, and existing banks are required by law to make up the difference. Anna Gelperin is a law and finance professor at Georgetown and a fellow at the Peterson Institute.
When FDIC pays out, it has by statute a mandate to go back and have an extraordinary, assessment on the living banks to recoup what it paid.
Gelperin points out those assessments became more comprehensive following the 2008 financial crisis, and the cost of them could trickle down to you and me and anyone who banks.
Is it going to cost you? Probably.
William Chittenden is a finance professor at Texas State University.
Either you would earn a little bit less on your deposit, or you might pay just a hair more on your loan.
Those costs are part of what Georgetown's Anna Gelperin says comes with the social compact of operating a banking system. I'm Stephanie Hughes for Marketplace.
If you want to sound swaggeringly in the know amid this banking crisis, pull out what's called the KBW Bank Index. It's a benchmark of 24 hand-picked bank stocks to gauge what investors are thinking of banks in general at any given time, especially useful this week, right? Well, the KBW Bank Index closed down 11.5% yesterday. But this morning, futures prices for some key regional banks, First Republic and others, are pointing up. That is the first whiff of a hint that investors are thinking the banking mess might have been contained. Yet do these medium-sized financial institutions need more oversight? Marketplace's Nova Safo is here with more.
Yeah, more oversight, or perhaps better oversight, David. In the short term, the Federal Reserve Board has announced a review of how Silicon Valley Bank was supervised, the results in a couple of months. And we spoke with Catherine Judge of Columbia Law School. She focuses on financial regulation, and she told us that regulators did clearly miss warning signs.
There were a number of flags suggesting that Silicon Valley Bank may be in trouble, maybe growing in ways that potentially pose threats, maybe increasing its reliance on government-backed sources of funding.
And one of those sources, she says, was the Federal Home Loan Bank System. It's a lender banks often go to when they really need cash. And just yesterday, the system raised more than $88 billion by selling short-term bonds because it says it's seeing heightened demand from banks.
Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts has an opinion piece in the New York Times putting the blame on a rollback in the rules that were put in after the last banking crisis. You saw that, Nova.
I did. And the rollback she's talking about was in 2018. Instead of needing $50 billion in assets, now a bank needed $250 billion before stricter regulations. And the question now is, what new rules, if any, are needed to make sure these banks are well managed, David?
All right, Nova, thank you. Markets, Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ futures are up between 2 and 0.3%. The bond market surged yesterday, but interest rates are off their lows this morning. The 10-year is up slightly, 3.61%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Viking. With small ships that bring travelers closer to the destination, there is more time to explore, offering cultural enrichment and immersive experiences on board and on shore. Viking.com.
Remember during high COVID, people moving from cities out to the country caused home prices to surge out in the sticks? Well, that drove up home prices, which does increase the tax base, but in some places, including the state of Maine, When home prices rise in a particular town, the town is judged less needy and less money comes in from the state to pay for the local schools. Maine Public's Robbie Feinberg reports from the last piece of Atlantic coastline before the Canadian border.
The tiny town of Lubec sits on the northern edge of Maine's jagged coastline along the Canadian border. Local school superintendent Kenneth Johnson says that despite the town's idyllic coastal setting, jobs and businesses are sparse.
Many years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, the town benefited from sardine canning plants, but those are long gone.
Like nearly every town in Maine, Lubec relies on a mix of state and local funds to educate its roughly 120 students. But this year, Johnson says, that's going to be a lot harder. The median price for a home in Washington County, where Lubec is located, has jumped by nearly 50% over the past 3 years. And Johnson says those higher prices are one factor leading to a projected loss of more than $100,000 in state funding for Lubec schools, leaving a sizable budget hole.
It'll be a very, very strong challenge to try and maintain the level of service that they are accustomed to and avoid deep budget cuts.
Communities across southern and coastal Maine are wrestling with the same problem. Steve Bailey, the executive director of the Maine School Management Association, says that in general, Maine's school funding formula uses property values to determine the relative wealth of each community and how much state subsidy it receives. So when home prices skyrocket in a particular town, state funding drops.
That particular piece has given the impression anyway that, towns are able to raise more money to be able to support education.
Bailey says it's all added up to less state funding for many districts at a time when inflation is only increasing the costs of heat, electricity, and teacher wages. In a statement, the Maine Department of Education says that Governor Janet Mills has already made historic investments in education funding. Mills is also pledging to add more than $100 million for local schools in her latest budget proposal. School leaders say they're thankful for the support, but some are now calling for the state to adjust its school funding formula and to find new ways of assessing the relative wealth and economic needs of Maine's communities. I'm Robbie Feinberg for Marketplace.
And I'm David Brancaccio. You're listening to the Marketplace Morning Report from APM, American Public Media.